Hey friends, welcome back to another Seed Talk with Lisa and Layne. Hey Layne.
Hello, how's it going over there, Lisa?
It is busting loose. It's finally warm and I just walked the gardens and it is absolutely crazy how many flowers we have planted and vegetables this year. Oh my
Oh,
goodness.
good.
It's really fun and I love walking the garden this time of year because there's literally something new in the morning and something new in the evening. So
It's
things
so exciting.
it is very exciting.
Do you have as many cicadas there as we do here? We keep calling it Cicada City. It's like
Uh,
we're inundated.
We have none that I know of. I have not heard or seen any. And I know, yeah, because, Suzanne, my sister, lives close to you, and, she's like having them all the time.
Oh, yeah, they just will drop down and land on you. It's like you can't go outside without seeing them or interacting with them.
Well, good thing they don't bite, right?
Yeah, they don't. They're pretty friendly and I think they're cute. I know most people don't, but
Yeah, we kind of like bugs, don't we?
yeah.
So, friends, before we jump into our subject of the day, just to remind everybody that this broadcast is made possible by thegardenersworkshop.com, which is home base for everything. Let's see, everything grow cut flowers, but we also have vegetable seeds. Want everybody to know that. I just was out admiring my tomatoes and my squash and our beets and our peas that we're harvesting. So we are a one-stop garden shop. And that's home base to everything that we do. You'll find also our online courses. You're going to find a fully stocked garden shop, lots of free resources, and friends, just a lot of fun. I think people go in and fall in and don't ever come out for a long time. So we invite you to check that out. So Layne, what's up today?
Well, today we're going to be talking about 5 common coxcomb questions that we get, and we're going to be answering those. So it's anything from, should I pinch my plants? Some people have heard conflicting information about that. Why are they blooming in the tray or blooming so short out in the field? Which varieties are the best for drying? So we just have a bunch of different questions that we're going to go over about coxcomb.
Awesome. That's one of my favorite crops.
I know. And before we do get started, I just want to mention that we're actually talking about coxcomb, like I said, and it's Celosia argentea cristata, which is the crested type of celosia. And like we've mentioned many times before, it has this really beautiful textural look. It looks like coral, or more commonly, people call it a brain, the brain flower. And it has a nice velvety, fuzzy sort of look to it. Some flowers are more fan-shaped, some are more ball-shaped,
Yeah.
and it adds a lot of texture and interest to bouquets, and it also can take up a lot of space. So this is just a great one to include in your summer garden.
And it just lasts a long time, even out in the garden. And we just find that the beneficial insects, the good and the bad bugs, like to park in the crevices. And so
They
we just really
do.
love it. Yeah, we love it.
Okay, so let's move on to our first question, and it's going to be, should I pinch my coxcomb plants? I've seen conflicting information regarding this, and there's a reason there's conflicting information, right, Lisa? It actually has to do with which variety you're growing.
Exactly. So cockscomb, like some other, like sunflowers, there are some cockscomb that are what we call a single stem. That means there's one stem with one flower. And then there's branching cockscomb. And, you would not pinch the single stem. If you do, then you're liable to get some really tiny little stubble looking kind of things that don't even resemble what you're supposed to get. But
Right.
we do pinch the branching. So that's I'm really surprised sometimes at the number of even grower friends that I have that ask me that question. And it all comes down to the same as sunflowers, right? There are single stem sunflowers and there's branchers. You have to know which you're actually growing to know how to treat it.
Yeah, that is very confusing. And I know a lot of people that have reached out to ask us this question. They'll say the sources that they're referencing either say, don't ever pinch coxcomb or always pinch coxcomb.
Right.
So it is very confusing for people out there growing. So, what are some common varieties, examples of branching and single stem coxcomb that people might see out there on the market?
Sure. So the if you're watching this over on YouTube, you're seeing the beautiful images that Layne is displaying. And if you're listening on podcast, we recommend you drop in on the YouTube channel to watch it. The image on the left with the beautiful gold and red and scarlet, and they call it rose, but it looks like hot pink to me, and the bicolor and the orange, that is a variety known as chief. And chief can also, very similar to chief is kurumi. And that's a brancher. That's one that branches. Another one that branches is Kramer's. And those are known branching annual coxcombs. And then there are several varieties that are single stem, and literally they kind of come and go every few years, it seems like. So our go-to mainstay one that we love and has been around for several years is called spring green, which is the image that Layne has up. It is lime green and it gives you a nice big head. But there's other varieties. There's one now called Act, ACT, and there used to be, who I think Act kind of replaced, was Bombay. All three of those are single stems, so you would never want to pinch them.
So just do some research depending on which variety you're growing to make sure you're not disappointed if you do end up pinching them.
And if you don't pinch your branching, that's perfectly okay, because your first harvest, that central stem that you're going to make deep and make the cut, that is kind of like a pinch. That's just a later pinch. So if you're not sure and you're not really sure about your variety, I say don't pinch, plant it and see what grows.
And just the opposite of that too, if you have accidentally pinched, maybe you do want to wait around and see what happens. I know, Lisa, there have been some that we've found that are listed as single stem, but you actually did get a bit of branching on those.
It's true, and I fail to remember which one that was. I think it was Askew, wasn't it? I'm pretty sure, which is a really different looking coxcomb, and we didn't pinch it, but it after I made the first cut, it went on to produce additional stems, and I think even Act actually did that a little bit. So
Yeah, I'm thinking of Act Green. I know you had some branching on that one.
right, that's right. That was a couple seasons ago. So, sometimes you have to like live and learn from your own experience. But for a jumping off point, I would say if in doubt, plan it, don't pitch it, and see what happens and make the cut and see what returns.
All right, now we're going to move on to our second question, which is which coxcomb varieties are the best for drying? So whenever you're drying something, you want it to hopefully retain as much color as possible and obviously the shape. There are some varieties that were specifically bred or selected with their dried characteristics in mind, right, Lisa? And those are great options for this.
It's true. So this is Kramer's, and the Kramer's is a family in Pennsylvania, and I was fortunate enough, probably about 2 decades ago, to go to their farm. It was a conference, and their farm was on the conference tour, and I got to meet Mr. and Mrs. Kramer and their son, and they back then were they had a big farm, y'all. Everything they grew went to the New York markets, and it was for drying. That's what their crops were known for. So they were very specific in their seeking out of varieties. Well, this mix of coxcomb actually is called Kramer's mix, because Mr. Kramer just continued to save seed and isolate, and it was for those flowers that really just held their color the very best. And, we've learned through these last few years, Layne, that, we dry everything now to see what it does. And a lot of the other coxcombs dry beautifully, but they don't perhaps hold their color quite as close to their fresh color as this variety does. So the Kramer's is a really good one if you are intending to dry. It's beautiful fresh too, but it just tends to hold its color a little better dried.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, a lot of the other varieties, they do dry well in terms of holding their shape, and the colors are just a little more muted, which may actually be the color palette you're going for. So just keep that in mind.
I mean, I know that one of your favorites, I think we figured out it was the gold
Yeah,
cheek that just turned into this really beautiful color. So yeah, don't let that stop you from drying them, but this one just is a little more colorful.
yeah, that turned like an ochre sort of color. That was so
Yeah.
pretty.
Yeah.
Okay, now we're going to go on to our third question, and it's which coxcomb varieties have the biggest heads? I get this question a lot for some reason. People just want to grow. They'll say, which one has the biggest brains? That's what they'll say to me. So
I've
this
heard that
also,
before.
you've heard that too? Yeah, so that can also depend on the growing conditions and when you've planted it, and also how long you let it go in the garden before you harvest it. But are there any varieties that tend to have naturally bigger heads that you've noticed, Lisa? And then can you talk about some of the other factors that contribute to head size?
Sure. So, we are looking at the biggest for what we're shooting for is no bigger than a fist. Anything bigger than that, they just really aren't very useful as a fresh cut flower, which is our intended use of all of our flowers. But there are definitely some varieties that just tend to get bigger easier. And this one pictured was a great selection. This is Chief Red Orange or Orange Red, and it is the most productive and the largest heads. Those heads are bigger than our fist. I remember this particular year. This variety really fed our bouquet program because they were so reliable in getting larger. But what happens as they get larger is they're getting closer to developing seeds. So you really have to monitor all of that. And as you've alluded to, there's a lot of other things that can contribute to whether how big they get, the growing conditions, the heat, in addition to the variety.
And do be aware, if you are wanting to grow really big heads, please make sure to support your
Yeah.
plants in some way, either with netting or rings or twine, whatever you do. But just make sure you support them because they will flop. Those are big, heavy heads.
They're really heavy, and all it takes is, when they get wet in a rain, they just soak up that water like a sponge and they just go right down. So, yeah, not supporting coxcomb is perhaps one of the biggest gambles of the summer garden.
Something else we've mentioned on previous podcasts too is a lot of times some of the more expensive coxcomb varieties, they're actually more expensive because they do take a lot longer to go to seed or just produce less seed overall. So they give you a little more wiggle room in terms of the harvest stage because you can let them grow bigger and not have to worry about them getting really, really seedy, which we're going to actually talk about in our next question too.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Okay, that ties right into this question, which is which coxcomb varieties are the least seedy, Lisa, in your experience?
So, first off, the reason we're so concerned about this is you do not want seeds to be spilled onto your customer's table. It's okay if it's your table because you can kind of figure out what that is. But people often mistaken the little Celosia seeds as mouse droppings. I mean, it really freaks people out. It really upsets them, and they will never buy it from you again, if they even come back for other flowers, right?
Yeah.
So the more pricier seeds, which just means they've been hybridized with that characteristic in mind, and they're most recent, and it just means their seed is more expensive at this point in time. But the gift of that is you can leave them in the garden to develop longer because they are slower to go to seed, and when they do seed, it's a lot less, so they don't really look dirty. So yeah, the two varieties you have shown there, Spring Green and Coral Unlimited, which Coral Unlimited particularly has a beautiful, we call that a fan. These are fan types. They aren't the ball like that big red orange that you just saw. And so when they're a fan shape bloom, the sides are exposed. So you don't want them to be dirty looking, and that's what seed development looks like. The Coral Unlimited is really, really beautiful and slow to go to seed for us. So that's why it's worth it to us to invest in that seed.
And something I like about these varieties that are less seedy, as we're calling it, is for home gardeners. Maybe you don't want to have to start seeds as frequently. On the farm,
Yeah.
Lisa, you do like to start single stem coxcomb every single week, and that makes sense for you. But maybe for a home gardener, they don't want to have to do that. And this
Right.
just buys you more time, and you can start more seeds at less frequent intervals and then just leave them to get a little more developed out there in the garden before cutting them.
That's a really good point. I mean, and the blooms hold up really beautifully. It's that whole getting it bigger and not developing seed is the dicey game.
Now we're going to move on to our final question. And this is probably the most common question that I am answering all the time about coxcomb. And it's my seedlings are budding up in the tray, or my plants are blooming really short out in the field. What should I do? So if someone has a branching type or a non-branching type, what would you do in that situation, Lisa? And why is it happening?
So, I mean, it's all about most often stress. Celosia is day length sensitive, but it is very sensitive to sitting in I mean, particularly if you start in plug trays or in containers, it really does not like for its roots to hit the sides of the container and start winding around. They're super sensitive. And when that happens, when they're in a container, that just sets them up to be stressed. And when they're stressed, they do crazy things. And oftentimes that means blowing up a bloom, when it's only 4 inches tall or something. So if that happened to me in a tray for a branching variety, and I just want to say that that is a gorgeous tray of Celosia coxcomb you have up there, Layne,
It
which
is.
is not budding up. I can
No.
almost promise you that is either Kramer, Chief Gold, or probably Kramer's. They have really beautiful foliage. And that's a really, really pretty one. So if you have a branching coxcomb budding up in the tray, depends on how busy we are. Sometimes we'll just plant them and see what happens. Other times we'll pinch them in the tray, but then we need to allow time for them to recover from the pinch before we plant them, which is about 7 to 10 days. And it just really depends on where we are. I don't worry nearly as much about those blooms as I used to. Just today, Bobo said, there's some grasses over there that are blooming at 8 or 10 inches. We've had this crazy cooler weather. They just aren't very happy. And she said, "Do you want me to go cut them?" And I'm thinking, heck no, we have more important things to do. We'll just see what happens. So what I would do in a tray for a brancher is either pinch it and then delay planting for 7 to 10 days, or I'd plant it and then delay and do it out in the garden, a couple weeks after they're planted, just to walk along and snip the center out to get the branching going. Because what'll happen is you just don't want it wasting energy, working on that bloom when it could just be making you branches. However, if it's a single stem variety like that Coral Unlimited or Spring Green, you just have to plant them and cross your fingers and not let that happen. That happens because you've either started too early or they're very stressed for whatever reason. And we don't typically, we try not to start the single stem celosias the very first round of warm season tender annuals, because sometimes we do get these funky springs that it's still just too cold at night. They just aren't very happy, and we don't want to make those single stem high dollar seeds unhappy. So put that in your pipe. We would always start them on our second round of succession plantings. So there is no help for them once that happens.
So even with the single stems, you'd still go ahead and try planting them out rather than throwing them in your compost pile.
Oh no, we'd plant them, and we'd plant them tight together, which we always do with single stems, like 8 rows in a 30-inch bed. And that just encourages them. Water them in, give them a little extra TLC to get them cozied in so they can just take off and grow and hope that it's warm.
And I just wanted to read an excerpt from the culture sheet for the spring green variety. It says that Celosia is very sensitive to root damage, which will result in early bud formation, deformed flowers, and less uniformity. So plant before they get root bound, which is just what you were saying. And then it also says it's important to maintain consistent moisture, especially for the first 2 weeks after transplanting to prevent premature flowering. And it notes that it's a quantitative short day plant, meaning short days are going to promote faster flowering. So just to reiterate what you just said, it's about the conditions and stress
Yep.
and day length and everything like that.
Yeah, and another thing is I think that my great success with this whole family of Celosias, whether it's Plumosa or Cressida or any of the coxcombs at all or the plumes, is because we soil block. And soil block averts a lot of that root stress situation. And that David Dowling and I had that talk one day. It's like, you grow the most amazing celosia and so much of it. How can you be so successful all the time? And I definitely attribute that we don't grow it in any type of container because it does not like it.
And I would just add what you mentioned before. This is a warm season plant, so don't plant it out too early. Really make sure that you wait the proper amount of time before you get that first round of plantings in.
And Layne, I'm glad that you said that because that is just really one of the tips that I have tried to hit a home run on, is really helping people to understand when you truly embrace warm season tender annuals and cool season tender annuals, you don't feel pushed to plant early because you've got stuff going almost all the time, right? And why that just works to your benefit, because they just perform better when you plant them into their preferred conditions. And Celosia is a great example. I also talk about Lysianthus this way. You know, if you plant them and they aren't happy, they'll just sit out there and pout and not do their job. And it's very annoying to the person, but it's like you didn't give them what they wanted. And yeah.
When do you typically like to get your first round of Celosia plants in the ground?
So because we're always working on projects that need blooms, we always are pushing the envelope, and that means that we take extra steps. That means that our beds are made and covered with the Bio 360 film with the black side up weeks before it's time to plant. In addition to that, the minute that we plant, we hoop and cover to block the wind and concentrate the heat. So we typically have transplants ready to go in the ground the week following our last expected frost date.
All right, well, that was it for our 5 common coxcomb questions episode. Hopefully that answered some of the questions that you might be having. Remember that if you're enjoying Seed Talk, we always appreciate when you share it with a friend or leave us a review or rating in a podcast app or a comment and like over on YouTube. And thank you so much for joining us again. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're watching or listening so you won't miss any of our future episodes.
So friends, we appreciate you being here, and don't forget to tell a friend about Seed Talk.
Yeah.
Ciao.
Bye.